Hi, and welcome to this afternoon's Books Alive online event with Brian Falkner, author of Katipo Joe, Spycraft, and Ellie, a librarian from St. Patrick's College in Wellington. Katipo Joe, Spycraft, is a finalist in the New Zealand Book Awards for children and young adults in the young adult fiction category. Thank you to the New Zealand Libraries Partnership Program for the opportunity to host these events this week and last week. Brian and Ellie, whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Thanks for that. Hi, Brian. Welcome to New Zealand, remotely, if not in person.
That's right. It's a bit hard to get across there at the moment. Bubbles keep bursting.
They do. Nobody really knows what they're doing, but it's lovely to see you here and to be able to chat to you with lots of students and other librarians and people watching.
Well, hi to all those students, first of all. Now, is it a particular school we're looking at? Is it Seatown School?
Yeah, Seatown School have been fantastic, sending me some questions. They're really excited to be able to hear some things today.
Well, a special shout out then, hi to all the kids at Seatown School. Great to see you guys. Not that I can actually see you, but great to have you along.
Yeah, so should we start straight in with one of their questions?
Why don't we?
Sounds good. They had a few questions about how you became a writer. In particular, I think what interested them was whether this was something you enjoyed or were good at when you were their age, back in intermediate or secondary school.
Yeah, I absolutely did. In fact, I might even say primary school, that I really enjoyed reading from a very young age. And reading is the natural precursor to wanting to be a writer, of course. So, in fact, I know a lot of authors, and I don't know any that weren't a very strong reader when they were young. And I guess that makes sense. So at primary school, certainly at intermediate school, at Northcote Intermediate School, there's a shout out for Northcote Intermediate, my old intermediate. That's Northcote in Auckland, of course, not Northcote in Christchurch. It was a big thing for me to read, and that led to the love of writing. But I was writing stories, certainly I remember while I was at Northcote College, and possibly even a bit younger, writing short stories mainly. I really enjoyed it. No, it was not sure how good I was back in those days, but in terms of enjoyment, absolutely.
Yeah. So you said that it was a love of reading that led you into writing. Was there any particular author or genre or something that you read that stayed with you?
There are a few authors, going back to when I was, really young. So as a very young reader, I loved the Enid Blyton series. Started with The Secret Seven, moved on to The Famous Five. I thought I was so grown up when I graduated to The Famous Five from The Secret Seven. But those stories full of adventure and daring do and smugglers and secret passages, I just adored them. And in fact, you'll often find secret passages and a few of those old Enid Blyton kind of things in some of my novels now. So that was when I was a bit younger. Now, as a teenager, I was reading adult fiction, and one of my favorite authors was Alistair MacLean, and he writes very exciting, suspenseful thrillers. So again, I've a bit of a penchant for writing suspenseful thrillers nowadays. So I'm tracing that all the way back to those Enid Blyton and Alistair MacLean books. A few others just to quickly throw in. Willard Price, the Adventure series by Willard Price, the Amazon Adventure, Tiger Adventure, those ones. And also the Arthur Ransom Swallows and Amazons series.
Yeah. Hearing you talk about Enid Blyton and the secret passages and things absolutely brings it back. It's superb and very visual writing, a lot like yours. I can see that connection.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I have to fess up, I'm a complete fan. So this is an amazing opportunity for me. Katipo Joe, as a reader, I absolutely adored. Had me on the edge of my seat, had my children starving. They are used to that every now and again. When they get a good book, I'm just planted on the couch and they have to wait. And then I think the thing that stands out is there was one moment, and I won't put any spoilers in here just in case, but there was one moment where I did literally gasp out loud, and that doesn't happen often. So it was fantastic.
Can I quickly ask, are you talking about Katipo Joe Blitzkrieg, the first book in the series?
Both.
Both. Okay, that particular moment that you were
choose a favourite.
that particular moment you were talking about, there was that was in the red covered one in the
yes,
it was.
Yeah,
I do know the moment you mean.
Yeah. I'm sure when you put that in there, you knew you'd get some reaction. So Yeah.
Look, when I reread it, I react to it in pretty much the same way, and I know what's going to happen. So it doesn't change how you react to the scene.
Yeah. And then, of course, as a librarian, and I know other librarians I've talked to, it's just such a fantastic book, a fantastic series to be able to recommend to students. And you just know that when they bring it back, you're going to hear how much they enjoyed it. So really, really awesome. And a lot of the students were asking about how you came to be inspired to do those particular books. What was it about World War II or Hitler Youth, or what was it that came into your head?
Well, I grew up, I was born in the 1960s, so I grew up not that long, if you think about it, after the end of the Second World War in 1945. So for me, it was, although I obviously didn't experience it in any way, but it was recent history and it was a big part of my growing up. And I was quite fascinated by what had happened during the Second World War. The world we live in today has been largely shaped by that war, geographically and politically and a lot of other ways. That was had a big effect on the world we live in. So to understand the world we live in now, I think you need to understand that war. So I really wanted to write a series of books that would bring that era alive for young people and allow them to experience some of what went on, but not in the context of a sort of a history book or a dry recounting of events, and not in a didactic, educational sort of a way. I wanted to write an action-packed adventure story that just happened to take place during that time, so that students or readers would learn about that time through the experiences of the boy who's living through it, and would get to know a little bit about some of the things that went on. Now, I will just throw in here that I thought I was a little bit of an expert on World War II, but once I started doing research into it, I found out how little I really knew. And a lot of the things that I ended up putting in the book, so most of the stuff in the book is factual, except for Joe and his specific adventures himself. All the other stuff around him, that's actually true stuff. And in fact, the less likely it seems, if you read it and think, oh, yeah, that wouldn't have happened, it's probably true. It's probably a real event that I'm recounting. So I learned so many things that I had no idea about and was able to use them in the context of a novel.
So how long did it take you to do that research, and how did you go about it?
Reading. I've read a lot of books. I've even got some of them sitting around here somewhere. Books on spying during World War II, books about what it was like to live through World War II. There's some excellent books about what it was like to be a child during World War II. So I read a ton of books, and I'm still reading a ton of books because I'm currently working on the third book in the series, and there's just as much research going into that as into the first two. So there's also a lot of really good online resources. I do say I'm always very careful with online resources. I try and check things through at least 3 different places, because you can read some sites which appear to know what they're talking about, but get contradicted by other sites. Whereas I tend to trust books. If it's in a book and it's been vetted by a publisher, I'd like to think that I can rely on it. So yeah, mainly from books, a lot of reading.
Sorry, just trying to mute the school bell. Yeah, so you did quite a lot of research, and that took some time. What about writing? A lot of the students were interested about your writing process, and in particular, how long it takes you to write a book.
These ones longer than normal. My average time for a novel would be about 6 months full-time writing. But the first book in the series, I actually started that 2006. I came back to it a few times before. It was 2018, I think it was, that Scholastic approached me and asked me how it was going. And I then got on and finished off the novel. The second book was written in about a year, and it's taking about a year to write. So they're about double the length of the normal sort of novel I write. And it's all to do with the history and the interwoven storylines, and making sure they're as accurate as I can make them, and that the storylines connect in the right way. So yeah, they're quite complex novels, and the characters in them are probably a little more complex than I would normally have put in a novel. And there's a reason for that, is just to try and enhance the realism. I really want these books to seem real to the reader, because that way I think I can make World War II seem real for the reader.
Yeah, yeah. I think what you said earlier about bringing it alive for a new generation is so important, because I come from the perspective of a history teacher anyway, but I think if we remember history, then we learn so much from it. So it's fantastic to hear that research that's gone into it. But as you say, having an adventure story means they're more likely to read it. So.
Well, that's certainly the plan, isn't it? There's a saying, I can't remember who said it, about if we forget history, we're doomed to repeat it.
We're doomed to repeat it.
That is something that I've actually, in fact, if I may, very quickly from Katipo Joe from Spycraft, the second book. Now, this is a little quote. Now, if you know the books, you know that Joe, as an older man who survived the war, spoiler alert, writes his memoirs, and excerpts from his memoirs are included in the books. So this is one of the memoirs from the second book in the series from Spycraft. He says, "I've been accused of whitewashing the Nazi leadership in my memoirs. Some people say I make them seem human, but therein lies the problem. I saw these men up close. They were human. If we think of them only as monsters and demons, we may lose sight of the fact that they were very much like you and I. They had the same number of eyes, ears, and limbs. If we forget what humans are capable of, we risk it happening all over again." And that just ties into that idea that if we forget about history, we are doomed to repeat it. Atrocities, if we forget about them, if we brush them under the carpet, don't like to think about them, then they're more likely to happen again in the future.
Yeah, very, very powerful words from Joe. And I think the other quote from Joe's memoirs that I often use when I'm telling students about the book is that idea that he sees himself as a villain, that people have called him a hero, but he sees himself as a villain. And it's that other quote, that history is written by the victors. And Joe seems to say that it's only that he came out on the right side of it that people see him as a hero. But what I wondered personally was how you see Joe. So stepping back from how Joe sees himself, do you see him as a hero or a villain?
Oh, no, he's definitely a hero. And the way that I want the reader to view Joe is as a hero, but who's had to do some very awful things. Now, we understand why he does them. We know what would happen if he didn't do them. But he's put in a situation where he has to make a decision and do something which may not be very good. And understanding that, I think, is why we can empathize with Joe. We put ourselves in his situation and think, what would I do if I was in that situation? But he looks back and thinks that was a terrible thing I did. Yeah. But if he hadn't done it, then the world might be a very different place today. So, I think we understand why he does it. He doesn't necessarily feel good, and he shouldn't feel good. He shouldn't feel good about some of the things he's done, but there was no choice.
No, the wrong thing for the right reasons. And it makes him such a complex and powerful character. You can never just take him as a flat character. And I'm so pleased to hear that you're working on the third book, and that we will get to know more of the complexities and the situations that he finds himself in. So do you have an ending in mind? One of the things the students asked was, when you start writing a book, do you know how it's going to end? And I would extend that to say, do you know how the series will end?
Well, it's an interesting thing about the series. So the deal with Scholastic is 3 books. So this third one should be the last. It might depend on how sales go and what they think by the time we get to the end of the third, whether they want to extend it. It's happening chronologically during the war. Yeah. So when we get to the end of the third book, we're in 1942. So there are 3 more years after that if we did want to continue. But in terms of the end, I actually wrote the end before I wrote anything else with the third book in the series. And I'm not sure. I'm trying to think if I did the same thing with the second book. Let me have a quick look of the ending. No, that one I might write more chronologically. But this third book in the series, I wrote the end and then went back to the beginning and started from the beginning, working towards the end that I'd already worked out.
Yeah. You said earlier that the more unbelievable things in it, the more likely they are to be true. One of the questions the students had, and I automatically assumed it can't possibly be something that was true, was whether the Hitler Youth did in fact have a competition, as comes out in that second book.
The competition we won't say what it's for. Look, they probably had some kinds of competitions. The particular one that's in Katipo Joe's Spycraft is completely made up. Yeah. But it's not inconceivable that they could have done something like it. So that's the next thing I guess I did with the book, is that if it hadn't actually happened, was it likely that it could have happened?
Yeah.
And if it could have happened, if the situations, the characters, the real life people might have made something like that happen, then absolutely. Then I feel free to include it. For example, there's a film being made in the second book. It's being made by Leni Riefenstahl, who is a well-known real life German filmmaker who made some propaganda films during the Second World War, but apparently was a very talented filmmaker. So she is involved in the making of the film, which is part of the competition. It's almost a little bit like a Survivor competition or a Big Brother sort of a competition, but set within the context of 1940s.
Yeah, I think you're right. It tied in very much to that idea of the Nazi propaganda machine.
Yes.
That so many of those messages were so powerfully put. And you could just, as you say, you could absolutely see it happening, whether it did or not. It fits into that history, which is amazing.
Another thing that the Nazis were very big on was what they called the big lie, that if you had something you wanted to get across, you could lie about it, and the bigger the lie, the more likely people were to believe it. So if you had a big lie and you repeated it and repeated it and repeated it, then people would come to believe it. And that was a big part of what Goebbels, the propaganda minister, and Hitler were all about. And so I've tried to get a little bit of that across in the books as well.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned just before that you started this book and you put it aside and you picked it up and you put it aside and you picked it up. Is that something that's quite common in your writing process, or do you have some books where they just come in a flash and you sit down and that's what you're focused on?
Yeah, it's unusual. There's only one other book that I've done it to, and that's a book called Shooting Stars, which was a finalist in the Book Awards, I'm going to say 3 years ago. And of course, that was the year that Maurice G wrote another young adult book. So he won. You can't compete against Maurice G. So Shooting Stars was the other book that I picked up, put down, and just couldn't quite make it happen. And eventually, with both of these books, when I figured out how to make it work, then it carried on and we finished the book. And quite specifically in Blitzkrieg, in the first book in the series, the problem I had was that Joe grows up in Germany, in Berlin, in before the war, in 1938, and then is involved in the Blitz. And it was the passage in between that I was struggling with. He goes back to New Zealand and he has some time in New Zealand. He makes friends, he goes to school, and I was writing all that. And I was struggling because the pace of the book had slowed down immensely. There was nothing exciting. The war was not involved. And the way that I eventually figured out how to deal with that is I eliminated it. I got rid of it. So it's now referred to in backstory. His time in New Zealand, he talks about his friends, some of the things he did, but we don't actually have a series of chapters where he is in New Zealand. And for the reason of simply of pacing of the novel. Yeah.
But I think in some ways, those chapters are still there. I know I've talked to other authors who have talked about the piles and piles and piles of information that never, in its literal sense, makes it into a book. But I think in the character of Joe, you can sense that he's a Kiwi kid. And without those years, it wouldn't have been so strong. And that's a connection that our students can make and that even I made. He felt like a Kiwi. And without those years there, and perhaps without you writing those years, even though the chapters didn't make it in, we might not have had that sense of Joe as a Kiwi boy.
Well, when he's relating stories about having a hangi on the East Coast beaches, I think we can relate to that. Whereas people from outside of New Zealand probably have no idea what we're talking about.
Yeah. One of the other librarians asked me, in terms of that, what is the international success of Katipo Joe at the moment?
Well, it's only published in New Zealand and Australia. Oh, really? So I'm obviously hoping that it will find a much wider audience. I think the fact that it's centered on a New Zealand main character shouldn't limit it. I think, it's an international story about an international war. So I am hoping, so that's really, we'll be hoping to hear back at some point that it's made it further afield. I mean, in England, America, who knows? But,
we both felt very much that it would find a great deal of success in England and America, that it's the kind of story that really, as you say, has that international basis that everyone can relate to, but it's still ours.
And yes, it is. It's a New Zealand story.
Yeah. So how much of you do you put into your characters? Because you have these amazing adventures that you're setting them into, but the characters themselves have an authenticity, which I think is fantastic. How much of that comes from you putting your own self into them?
It's said that in every character that an author writes, there's a certain element of them, no matter who the character is, whether it's one of the good guys, one of the bad guys. There's always a little bit of the author there. I wouldn't say that Joe is much like me. He's much taller, blonder, stronger, fitter, much braver than I will ever be. But he does have a well-defined moral compass. He knows what's right and what's wrong, which is why, of course, he feels so bad about the things he's had to do. And I think that's something that I share with him, is a very defined, clear sense of right and wrong, and a defined moral compass that basically guides him through his actions. That's probably the only real thing. I'm certainly nowhere near as brave. He does some pretty brave things that I would never even dare to attempt.
On the other hand, he's put into situations where he has to draw on that strength, I think, that perhaps if he'd been able to grow up as a Kiwi in our times, he may never have needed to show that bravery. So
no, and physically he's affected by his time in New Zealand as well, because he's been living on a farm. So as a young man, he's been helping out on a farm. So as a physical person, he's quite strong, fit. So that part plays a part in his character as well, as his physical strength.
Yeah. I know some of the students who are listening and watching today are probably like you were, starting to write some short stories and figure out who they are as a writer and find their voice. What advice would you give them?
Like the number one piece of advice I try to give to all young writers is firstly to take something in your own life that you can write about. Now, that doesn't mean you write about that specific thing that happened to you, but rather it means you need to be writing about something in your life that made you feel something, that caused you some kind of emotion. When we read, we read in order to feel something. We want to feel an emotion. I mean, there's no point in reading otherwise. It's why we read books, is to feel. We read horror books to feel scared. We read action adventure books to feel excited. We read romance novels to feel love. So if we read in order to feel, that's a really good tip for young writers. That's your job, is to make the reader feel something. So how do you do that? How do you make the reader feel some kind of emotion? Well, find emotional events in your own life. Think what caused you to feel the way that you felt, and then see if you can encapsulate that in a story. And it doesn't have to be the same thing that happened to you. It just needs to be the same emotion. You need to find a way to bring through that same feeling that affected you so much and bring that into your writing. And very much that's what I try to do with all my books, and specifically with the Katipo Joe series, that there are some very emotional moments. And I can't tie all of them straight back to obviously the events that have happened in my life, but some of them I can.
Yeah. It makes for very powerful writing. And what about that good old shark in the tank writer's block? I know I've had some students who have started a wonderful story and then they just get stuck. What do you do to get past it when you just hit that point and you can't think how to break through?
Look, the first thing is to feel free about doing this, right? So I always say there's two, for me at least, there's two kinds of writer's block. There's the writer's block where you're writing something and it just doesn't seem very good, and you just think, there's no point in doing this. I'm writing, it's rubbish. I just don't, it's no good. Now, Hemingway famously said that the first draft of anything is poop. That's not quite the word he used, but you get the idea. And that's very liberating to think about that. But my favorite quote about writing is from Shannon Hale, another author, who said, I'm writing a first draft. I'm simply shoveling sand into a box so that later I can build castles. Now, that is a very powerful quote because it's liberating. I actually say this to myself most days when I'm writing. I'll be writing something going, that's not very good, but I'm only shoveling sand into a box, right? You put the sand in the box, and then later on you go and build the castle. In the edits, you build the castle, but you can't build the castle if you don't have the sand sitting in the box to build it with. So you've got to get that in there. Now, understanding that, it's so liberating because as you're writing, you're feeling it blocked, it's not quite working, then you just say, okay, I'll accept it, I'll come back to it. Now, the second kind of writer's block is where you really have no idea what's going to happen. But usually in that case, I know what's going to happen somewhere down the line. I'm trying to get to this point here. I just don't know what happens in the meantime. So what I'll often do is go and write the bit that I do know. I'll write a chapter that might be 10 chapters away, but I'll do that. And while I'm doing it, I usually get a few ideas for the intermediary chapters, the chapters are going to happen leading up to it. Now, if I don't, then what I often do, I take the chapter that I've just written and I'll try and write the chapter before it, leading into it, and then the one leading into that. So it's not a bad idea. It's to work backwards instead of trying to work forwards. And that's another way of bridging that gap between what you know here and what you know here, and you're just not sure what happens in between. So there's my answer for a writer's block. There's two different things that I do to try and avoid it.
Yeah, some really practical ideas. I think the students will well appreciate that.
Thank you.
I know you said at the beginning that you had a couple of bits of Katipo Joe that you'd like to share with us. Do you want to read us another little bit now?
How long have we got? I've just got the prologue is about 3 minutes long. Have we got long enough for that?
Yeah, it sounds perfect.
All right, that's fine. This is the prologue for Katipo Joe Spycraft. Prologue, Wanborough Manor, Special Operations Executive SOE Training Centre, Surrey, England, 26th of May, 1941. The Irishman stops as the dog plants her paws in front of him and bares her teeth jagged in the light of a reluctant moon. She's never bared her teeth at him before. Perhaps she can smell the blood on the knife. Flannery steps to one side, off the white pebbled path near where a broken cartwheel, choked by long weeds, slowly rots against the side of the barn. To the other side, an old hand pump drips slowly, constantly, each plunk juddering the reflection of wispy moonlight on the surface of the water in the trough below. The dog moves with him, blocking his way. "Good girl," Flannery says softly. Her lips open wider, and she begins to snarl. In a moment, she'll bark, and everything will be lost. "Shh, Grable," he says. She's a beagle, Joe's dog, or she was. Now she belongs to Rosie, the horsey woman who lives in one of the cottages on the grounds of the old manor house. The merest thought of Joe causes Flannery to clench his teeth. Everything had been going so well before Joe came along. MI5 had suspected nothing. Flannery takes a step backwards, hoping to settle the dog. One bark will wake the inhabitants of the small village. One bark and everything will have been for nothing. He won't get another chance. What he'll get is a drop and a sudden stop at the end of a rope. He takes a firm grip on the knife, his palms sweaty despite the cool night air. "Good girl, Grable," he says, holding out a hand for her to sniff so she'll know it's him. She knows him. She's a friend. She growls again. Is she simply being protective of her new pups? Or does the beagle really have some kind of sixth sense about people? It is as if she knows what he has just done. Flannery is a bear of a man, thick-necked and broad shoulders, although now in his 40s and running to fat. But neither time nor weight has diminished his skills, honed to a fine edge, training new recruits in Churchill's secret army. When the dog draws in a breath, preparing to bark, Flannery is ready. The car is waiting for him near the intersection of the main road to Guildford. It is dark, its engine is off, and it appears to be deserted. But a door opens as he approaches, and a man in a dark suit emerges. He wears an armband with the band blue and white lightning bolt of the BUF, the British Union of Fascists. Flannery's first impression of the man is that he is a weasel. He is short and thin, with a pointed snout and ears. His neck seems too long, with a bend at his Adam's apple. The man looks around carefully, checking that they are not being watched, before snapping out a Nazi salute and a quiet "Heil Hitler." When Flannery does not return the salute, the man's paw darts into his jacket and re-emerges with a pistol. "Who are you?" His voice is thin and reedy. His accent is South London. "Put your gun away. I'm the man you're waiting for," Flannery assures him. "But don't be expecting any of that Heil Hitler bollocks from me." "Are you not a believer in the cause?" the man asks, but the pistol disappears back into his jacket. "I may dance with the devil," Flannery says, "but that doesn't mean I have to kiss him goodnight." So that's the prologue for book 2 in the series.
There's nothing quite like hearing an author read their own work. It is absolutely fabulous. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
So is there anything else that you can think of that you would like to share with our students?
Well, if they are enjoying the series, then just stay tuned. If they're reading it and enjoying Joe's adventures, then book 3 is on its way. I'm working as hard and as fast as I can. It is a slow process, and I've also, partly because I've got to tie up all the loose ends of the other 2 books. But you just wait, and we'll hopefully have that out. The plan is for Anzac Day for next year.
So I know authors hate this question. I'm going to throw it at you anyway. Do you have any favourites amongst your books? Any standouts?
I do love the Katipo Joe series, and I love it partly because of the viewpoint we get as Joe looking back, and the insight we get into his mind as an older person, looking back at his escapades as a younger person. And I think that rounds out the character, and it rounds out the story in ways that is almost impossible to do in most books. My absolute favorite, though, of all my books, I've mentioned it already today, is Shooting Stars, a book about a boy growing up in the New Zealand bush, hiding away from civilization. That has always been my favorite. And for the reasons of emotions that we talked about before, it's a real roller coaster of emotions, Shooting Stars. And for that reason, even if I read it again, and I've read it numerous times since I wrote it, it takes me on that same roller coaster of emotions that I hope the reader will go through.
Yeah. So those for whom Katipo Joe has been their first exposure to your work, you'd recommend Shooting Stars as their next stop?
I would definitely go with that as the next one. Yeah, absolutely. And if they'd like to move on from there, then there's the Tomorrow Code, Brainjack, or even the Rampage at Waterloo, a book set during the Napoleonic Wars, which are in the similar vein in some ways to the Katipo Joe series.
With that wonderful sense of history too, isn't it?
Yeah, again, the research was incredible for those books too. Mm.
Yeah. So why the Napoleonic Wars?
Well, without being too much of a spoiler for that series, it's set in an alternative universe. So it's an alternative world. So it's alternative history. So not quite the world that we know today. And when you're working with alternative history, you can do what you like. You can go and change anything in history, then imagine the world if that thing had been different. And so the thing that I changed was the death of all the dinosaurs, the wiping out of the dinosaurs. So I imagined a world in which dinosaurs continued to live amongst us. Now, all the dangerous dinosaurs live in the Americas, which never got populated because of all the dangerous dinosaurs. But there are smaller ones that live in Europe and in the other countries. So imagining that world, what would happen if someone like Napoleon Bonaparte got hold of some of these more dangerous dinosaurs and then somehow enlisted them to work in his army? Now, back in those days, a dinosaur would be like a weapon of mass destruction. Yeah. If you brought a dinosaur into the modern world somehow, and the modern weapons we have, that wouldn't last 5 minutes. But back then, when it was muskets and cannons, then a dinosaur would have been horrendous. So that's the basic premise of the book, that there are dinosaurs at a very famous battle called the Battle of Waterloo, which is where Napoleon was finally defeated in the real world. But in my book, he actually wins the Battle of Waterloo thanks to having some T-Rexes in his army.
A bit like Hannibal and his elephants, I guess.
Yeah, well, a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because I have 2 boys of my own. One is absolutely adores Shooting Stars and Katipo Joe, and the other is dinosaur obsessed. And so the whole concept of dinosaurs still being there and being part of a war really captured him.
Oh, has he read The Rampage or not yet?
Yes.
Oh, he has. Oh, good.
Yeah, loved it.
Excellent.
So I think we are just about out of time. Is that right? Yeah. So I just want to say a huge thank you to you for talking to us today. And also it's always wonderful to be able to thank an author directly for those books that keep you on the edge of your seat, the books that make you sit back and go, ah! And the ones where, I say to the students when I'm recommending Katipo Joe, I say to them, it's just unpredictable. You can't sit there comfortable. You can't sit there thinking, I know how this is going to end, because you just don't. And that makes for a fantastic book. So I do wish you all the best of luck with the announcement of the winners. I think it's next week.
Yes.
Certainly, I know that those listening and myself are well in the camp of Brian taking that one out.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
All right. Well, goodbye to all the kids from Seatoon who have been listening in or watching in. That's fantastic that you all were here, and everyone else that's also tuned in. So nice to meet you all virtually. And hopefully, if you haven't already read my book, you'll now be interested enough to go and pick it up and find a copy, and maybe start with the first in the series and move on to the one that's in the awards this year.
Thank you so much, both of you. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We have one more event at 2:30 if anybody wants to stay and wait for that one. If not, we will see you later.